Two German shepherds was crying underneath a school desk. What baby did next left everyone in tears. The sound of whimpering dogs at 3 in the morning would change everything. What 5-year-old Tommy Chen did when he found them would leave an entire town sobbing. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Frank Morrison had been cleaning Riverside Elementary School for 15 years, but he'd never heard anything like the sound that stopped him cold that Tuesday morning. It was 5:47 a.m., still dark outside, and the hallways echoed with a sound that made his skin prickle. Two distinct voices crying. Not human voices, something else. He set down his mop bucket, the metal handle clanging against the tile floor. The sound came again, muffled but desperate, from Mrs. Peterson's empty kindergarten classroom. Frank's hand trembled as he pushed open the door. There, huddled beneath a small wooden desk in the corner, were two German shepherds. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the hallway light like amber stones. Both dogs wore faded military service vests, the kind Frank had seen on TV, but never in person. One had a jagged scar running across its left eye, the fur around it white instead of the usual tan and black. The other favored its right front leg, holding it slightly off the ground, even while lying down. They weren't barking. They were crying. Actual tears streaming down their faces, their bodies shaking with what looked exactly like human grief. "Jesus!" Frank whispered, backing away slowly. His first instinct was to run, but something in those eyes stopped him. They weren't aggressive. They were broken. He fumbled for his phone, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial Principal Rivera's number. She answered on the 5th ring, voice thick with sleep. "Frank? What's wrong? You need to come to the school. Now. Is there a break-in? Should I call the police?" Frank looked at the dogs again. The scarred one had lifted its head, watching him with an intelligence that made his chest tight. "No police. Not yet. Just, please come." 20 minutes later, Principal Maria Rivera stood in the doorway of the classroom, her mouth slightly open. She'd thrown a coat over her pajamas, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy bun. "How did they get in?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the animals. "No idea. All doors were locked when I started my shift. No broken windows." Frank shifted his weight nervously. "Look at their vests." Maria stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. The vests were military grade, worn but well maintained. On the side of each vest, barely visible, were name patches. Atlas, Storm. "Service dogs," Maria said softly. "Military service dogs." The one labeled Storm, the one with the limp, let out another whimper. It wasn't the sound of a hurt animal. It was the sound of loss, pure and simple. "We should call animal control," Maria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Look at them," Frank said. "They're not strays. They're looking for someone." Before Maria could respond, the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the parking lot. Through the window, they saw headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. A woman emerged from an old Honda Civic, helping a small boy out of the back seat. "That's Sarah Chen," Maria said. "She drops Tommy off early on Tuesdays. She works double shifts at the hospital." They watched as the woman and child approached the building. The boy, Tommy, was small for 5 years old, with dark hair that stuck up at odd angles, despite his mother's attempts to smooth it down. He walked slowly, his Spider-Man backpack dragging on the ground behind him. But as they got closer to the building, something changed. Tommy stopped walking, his head turned toward the kindergarten wing, even though the classroom windows were on the opposite side. "Mama," they heard him say through the thin walls, "someone's sad." "Come on, baby. Miss Rivera will open the door for us." "No, Mama. Someone's really, really sad." Maria hurried to unlock the main entrance. Sarah Chen looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her scrubs wrinkled from what was clearly a long night. "Morning, Mrs. Rivera. I'm so sorry we're early again. My shift." "It's fine, Sarah." Maria forced a smile. "Actually, we have a bit of a situation." Tommy wasn't listening. He'd dropped his backpack and was walking down the hallway, his small feet making soft padding sounds on the tile. He moved with purpose, like a sleepwalker following a dream. "Tommy!" Sarah called, but her son didn't stop. He pushed open the door to Mrs. Peterson's classroom before any of the adults could stop him. They expected screams, panic, maybe even an attack. Instead, silence. When they reached the doorway, they found Tommy kneeling in front of the desk where the dogs hid. Atlas and Storm had stopped crying. They were staring at the boy with something that looked impossibly like recognition. "Hi," Tommy whispered. "I know you're looking for him." The dogs crawled out from under the desk, moving slowly, carefully. Storm's limp was more pronounced now, but both animals approached Tommy with their heads low, tails barely moving. When they reached him, they pressed their bodies against his small frame, and Tommy wrapped his arms around them like he'd known them forever. "Tommy, careful!" Sarah started forward, but Frank caught her arm. "Look," he said. Tommy was crying now, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. But he was smiling too, that strange combination of joy and sorrow that usually only adults understood. "They're messenger dogs," Tommy said, looking up at his mother. "They came to tell us something important." Maria knelt beside the boy, keeping a safe distance from the dogs. "Tommy, how do you know that?" Tommy tilted his head, considering the question like it was silly. "They told me." "Dogs can't talk, sweetie," Sarah said gently. "Not with words," Tommy agreed, "but they can talk. Atlas says his person is lost. Storm says he's hurt." He paused, his little forehead wrinkling. "They say his name is—" Tommy closed his eyes, concentrating. "Miguel, his name is Miguel, and he's very scared." Maria's phone was in her hand before she realized she'd pulled it out. She dialed the local Veterans Affairs office, even though it wouldn't open for another 3 hours. To her surprise, someone answered. "VA crisis line. This is James Park." "Mr. Park, this is Principal Rivera at Riverside Elementary. We have 2 military service dogs here. They showed up sometime during the night. The vests say Atlas and Storm." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Atlas and Storm? You're sure?" "Yes. Why? Do you know them?" "Everyone in our office knows them. They belong to Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos. He's been missing for 2 weeks. Maria felt her stomach drop. Missing? His wife reported him missing after a PTSD episode. He left their house in the middle of the night and never came back. The dogs disappeared from his home 3 days ago. We assumed they went looking for him. "Mr. Park, can you come to the school? I'm already grabbing my keys." While they waited, Tommy refused to leave the dog's side. He sat cross-legged on the floor, one hand on each animal, whispering things the adults couldn't hear. Sarah tried twice to pull him away, but each time the dogs would whimper, and Tommy would shake his head. "They need me," he said simply. Frank brought water bowls from the janitor's closet. The dogs drank gratefully, but never took their eyes off Tommy. There was something unsettling about it, the way they watched him like he was the answer to a question they'd been asking. "Tommy," Maria said carefully, "have you ever met these dogs before?" "No." "Have you ever met anyone named Miguel Santos?" Tommy scrunched up his face, thinking hard. "I don't think so. But—" He paused, looking at Atlas. "But I've dreamed about him." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "The nightmares. Oh my God, the nightmares." "What nightmares?" Maria asked. Sarah's voice shook. "For the past 2 weeks, Tommy's been having terrible nightmares. He wakes up screaming about a soldier who needs help. I thought it was from something he saw on TV. Tommy nodded solemnly. "The soldier in the forest. He's cold and his leg hurts, and he wants to come home, but he can't remember how." The room fell silent except for the sound of Storm's labored breathing. The dog's limp seemed worse now, and Frank noticed dried blood on his paw. "These dogs traveled miles to get here," Frank said quietly. "Look at their paws. They're torn up." "But why here?" Sarah asked. "Why our school? Why Tommy?" Before anyone could answer, James Park arrived. He was younger than Maria expected, maybe 35, with the straight-backed posture of someone who'd served. He took one look at the dogs, and his face went pale. "That's them. Those are definitely Santos's dogs." He knelt down, and Storm limped over to him, tail wagging weakly. "Hey, boy. Where's your dad, huh? Where's Miguel?" "Mr. Park," Maria said. "Tommy seems to have some kind of connection with them." James looked at the boy, who was now drawing something on a piece of paper Maria had given him to keep him occupied. "Connection? He says they're telling him things." "About Sergeant Santos." James's expression was skeptical until Tommy held up his drawing. It was crude, as 5-year-old drawings tend to be, but the details were unmistakable. A man in military fatigues, standing in front of a building with a flag. The man had a mustache and a scar on his chin. "That's Miguel," James breathed. "That's exactly what Miguel looks like." How could he possibly know that? Tommy looked up from his drawing. "He showed me." "In the dreams." James pulled out his phone and showed Tommy a photo. "Is this the man from your dreams?" Tommy nodded immediately. "That's him. He's in trouble." "We've been searching for 2 weeks," James said, running a hand through his hair. "His family is desperate. His wife Lisa, his daughter Emma, they're falling apart." "The dogs know where he is," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "Then why did they come here instead of leading us to him?" James asked, though he felt foolish asking a 5-year-old for answers. Tommy looked at Atlas, then back at James. "Because they needed me first. I'm the bridge." "The bridge? Between them and him? Between here and there?" Tommy stood up, his small body suddenly seeming older, more purposeful. "We need to go to the basement." "The basement?" Maria said. "Tommy, why the basement?" "Because that's where he left it." "Left what?" Tommy was already walking, the dogs flanking him like an honor guard. The adults had no choice but to follow. They descended the narrow stairs to the school's storage basement, a place filled with old desks, boxes of forgotten textbooks, and decorations from holidays past. Tommy walked straight to a corner behind a stack of plastic chairs. He pointed to a ventilation grate near the floor. There. Frank grabbed a screwdriver from a nearby toolbox and removed the grate. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a leather journal. James picked it up carefully, recognizing Miguel's handwriting immediately on the cover. "This is his. This is definitely his." "He came here months ago," Maria said suddenly, "for the Veterans Day assembly. He talked to the kids about service and sacrifice." James opened the journal, flipping through pages of neat handwriting. Most entries were mundane, thoughts about therapy, medication schedules, good days and bad days. But the last entry, dated 2 weeks ago, made him stop. "The dreams are getting worse," James read aloud. "I keep seeing the cabin where Sergeant Morrison taught me to read when I was 7, before my parents died, before foster care, before everything went wrong. Maybe if I go back there, I can remember what it felt like to be whole." "Sergeant Morrison," Frank said slowly. "I knew a Sergeant Morrison, ran a literacy program for at-risk kids back in the 70s, had a cabin up by Miller's Creek." "That's 15 miles from here," James said. "In the middle of the forest." Tommy tugged on James's sleeve. "He's there, but he's hurt, and the storm is coming." Everyone looked at the window. The morning sky had been clear, but now dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. "The weather report said clear skies all week," Sarah said. Tommy shook his head. "Storm is coming. Big storm. He won't survive it." "We need to organize a search party," James said, already pulling out his phone. "They won't believe you," Tommy said quietly. "Grown-ups never believe kids about important things." Maria knelt beside him. "We believe you, Tommy." "No," Tommy said, looking directly at her with eyes that seemed far too knowing for a 5-year-old. "You want to believe me." "That's different." The dogs suddenly stood at attention, both facing the same direction, northwest, toward Miller's Creek. They began whining again, but this time it sounded urgent, desperate. "We're running out of time," Tommy said. He looked at his mother. "Mama, I need to help him." "Baby, you're 5 years old. You can't. I'm the only one who can." Tommy's voice was steady, certain. "The dogs came for me. Not for them, for me." Sarah looked helplessly at the other adults. Maria was already on her phone with the police. James was calling the search and rescue team. But Tommy was right. She could hear it in their voices. They were skeptical. A child's dreams and 2 dogs showing up at a school wasn't enough to mobilize resources. "Mrs. Chen," Frank said quietly, "I've worked here 15 years. I've seen a lot of kids. Your boy, there's something special about him." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I've always known. Even when he was a baby, he would look at people like he could see inside them. The nurses at the hospital called him an old soul." Tommy had walked over to a dusty box in the corner. He pulled out a yellow rain slicker, child-sized, probably from some long-ago kindergarten play. He put it on over his clothes. "Tommy, what are you doing?" "Getting ready," he said simply, "for the storm." The dogs pressed against him, and for a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw something pass between them. Not just affection, but communication. Real, purposeful communication. 48 hours, Tommy said suddenly. "What?" James asked, looking up from his phone. "He's been hurt for 48 hours. His medicine ran out 36 hours ago. His body is starting to shut down." Tommy's voice was still high and childlike, but the words were impossibly precise. "His left leg is broken. He's been drinking rainwater from a leak in the roof. He has maybe 6 hours left." "How could you possibly know that?" James demanded. Tommy looked at Atlas. "He knows. He was there when it happened. The roof fell." Miguel pushed Atlas out of the way. "That's why Storm is limping. He tried to dig Miguel out and hurt his paw on the broken wood." James knelt in front of the boy. "Tommy, I need you to tell me exactly where this cabin is." Tommy closed his eyes. His small hands reached out and found both dogs, fingers burying in their fur. For a long moment, he was completely still. Then his eyes snapped open. "North on the old logging road, 3 miles past the fallen oak tree that looks like a dragon. Turn left at the creek where the water runs backwards. The cabin has a blue door, but you can't see it from the road because the honeysuckle has grown over everything." James typed frantically into his phone. "That's incredibly specific." Atlas remembers the way. He's been trying to lead people there, but nobody would follow him. "Then we follow him now," James said, standing up. "No." Tommy's voice was firm. "He won't leave me. And Storm can't make the journey again. His paw is infected." Sarah watched her son with a mixture of pride and terror. This was her baby, her little boy, who still needed help tying his shoes. But standing there in that too big raincoat, surrounded by 2 military dogs who looked at him like he was their last hope, he seemed like something else entirely. "The search and rescue team will be here in an hour," Maria said, closing her phone. "Too late," Tommy said. He walked to the small basement window and pointed at the sky. The clouds were moving in fast, unnatural for the season. "The storm will hit in 45 minutes. "That's impossible," James said, checking his weather app. "There's no storm system anywhere near." He stopped. His screen showed clear skies, but his eyes showed him something different. The darkness spreading across the sky was real, physical, undeniable. "Sometimes," Tommy said quietly, "the world sends storms when they're needed. To wash away what needs washing, or to force people to act." Frank crossed himself. He wasn't a superstitious man, but something about the boy's words made his skin crawl. "We can't send a child into a storm to find a missing veteran," Maria said. "It's insane." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "If Tommy's right, if this man only has hours left..." Atlas suddenly threw back his head and howled. It was a sound none of them had ever heard from a dog before, mournful and urgent and somehow human. Storm joined in, their voices harmonizing in a cry that seemed to shake the walls. Tommy started crying again, but he didn't move to comfort the dogs. "They're calling him, telling him to hold on, but he can't hear them anymore. He's too far gone." "What do you mean, too far gone?" James asked. "He's leaving," Tommy whispered. "His spirit. It's starting to leave his body. That's why the dogs came for me, because I can call him back." "That's not possible," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. Tommy looked at him with those 2 old eyes. 3 years ago, a school bus went off the road, into the river. You heard about it?" Everyone nodded. It had been national news. A bus full of preschoolers had crashed during a field trip. One man had jumped into the freezing water and saved every single child before the bus sank. "That was Miguel," James said slowly. "He got a medal for it." "I was on that bus," Tommy said. "I was only 3, but I remember. I was unconscious under the water, not breathing. Miguel brought me back. He breathed life into me on the riverbank while everyone else was screaming." He paused, looking at the dogs. "That's why they came for me. Because Miguel and I are connected. He gave me part of his soul that day, and I kept it safe. Now he needs it back." Sarah's legs gave out. She sat heavily on a dusty box, staring at her son. "You never told me. You never said you stopped breathing." "I didn't remember until now. Until they helped me remember." Tommy gestured to the dogs, but my body remembered. That's why the nightmares started when Miguel went missing. My soul knew he was in trouble. The basement had gone completely silent except for the sound of Storm's labored breathing. Then, from somewhere far above, came the first rumble of thunder. "The storm," Tommy said. "It's here." As if his words were a trigger, rain began to pound against the small window. Not a gradual buildup, but an instant deluge that turned the glass opaque with water. "We have to go now," Tommy said, his voice urgent. "If the creek floods, we'll never reach the cabin." "Tommy, no," Sarah said, reaching for him. "You're not going out in this." "Then he dies," Tommy said simply. "And the part of him that lives in me dies too, and I'll never be whole again." The dogs moved to flank Tommy, their bodies protective. Atlas growled low in his throat, not at the humans, but at the storm outside, as if it were a living enemy. "I'll go," James said suddenly. "Follow your directions. Find the cabin." Tommy shook his head. "You won't make it. You don't have the connection. You'll get lost, and then 2 people will die instead of 1. "Then what do you suggest?" Maria asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Tommy walked to his backpack, which Frank had brought down from the hallway. He pulled out a juice box, a package of crackers, and something else, a small toy soldier, the kind sold at dollar stores. "This was in my pocket," he said, holding up the soldier. "The day of the crash. Miguel gave it back to me after he saved me, said it was my guardian angel." He looked at the adults, his face serene, despite the tears still on his cheeks. "Now, I need to be his." Before anyone could stop him, Tommy ran up the stairs, the dogs right behind him. The adults scrambled to follow, but by the time they reached the main floor, Tommy had already pushed open the front door. The storm hit them like a physical force, wind that shouldn't exist in their quiet town, rain that fell sideways, lightning that turned the dark morning into a strobe light of terror. Tommy stood on the front steps, his small body buffeted by the wind, but somehow not knocked down. The dogs pressed against him from either side, keeping him stable. "Tommy!" Sarah screamed, but the wind stole her voice. The boy turned back to look at them. His face was calm, almost glowing in the strange stormlight. "I'll bring him home," he said, though they shouldn't have been able to hear him over the storm. "I promise." Then he walked into the tempest, 2 German shepherds at his side, and disappeared into the driving rain. Sarah tried to run after him, but James caught her. "We follow in the car," he shouted over the wind. "We can track them." They piled into James's SUV, Sarah, James, Maria, and Frank. The vehicle rocked in the wind as James started the engine. Through the windshield, they could barely make out 3 shapes moving down the road. 1 small, 2 large, moving with impossible purpose through the storm. "How is he not being blown away?" Maria asked, her voice awed. "Look at the dogs," Frank said. "They're shielding him." It was true. Atlas and Storm had positioned themselves to create a barrier against the worst of the wind, their bodies taking the brunt of the storm's fury. They moved in perfect synchronization, like they'd done this before. James followed at a distance, not wanting to spook them, but unwilling to let them out of sight. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the rain, turning the world into a watercolor painting of gray and green. "He's turning," Sarah said, pointing. Tommy had indeed turned off the main road onto what looked like an overgrown path. A wooden sign, barely visible through the rain, read, "Old Logging Road, Closed." "That's the road he described," James said, turning to follow. The SUV's wheels spun in the sudden mud, but James managed to keep them moving. The forest closed in around them, branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. 3 miles felt like 30. The road was more suggestion than reality, washed out in places, blocked by fallen branches in others. But always, just ahead, they could see Tommy and the dogs moving steadily forward. "There," Frank said suddenly, "the fallen tree." A massive oak lay across the old road, its trunk twisted into a shape that, with imagination, could indeed look like a dragon. Tommy didn't hesitate. He climbed over it, the dogs somehow scrambling over despite Storm's injured paw. James had to stop the car. They'd have to follow on foot from here. "Sarah, you should stay in the car," Maria said. "That's my son," Sarah said, already opening her door. "I'm going." They climbed over the dragon tree, their clothes instantly soaked through. The forest was darker here. the canopy blocking what little light made it through the storm clouds. But ahead, they could still see Tommy's yellow raincoat, a beacon in the darkness. The boy had stopped at a creek. The water, normally probably a gentle trickle, was now a raging torrent, and impossibly it was indeed flowing backwards, uphill, defying every law of physics. "How is that possible?" Maria whispered. "It's not," James said, but they were all seeing it. Tommy didn't hesitate. He walked into the water, which should have swept him away instantly. Instead, it parted around him, creating a narrow path. The dogs followed, and the adults had no choice but to do the same. On the other side of the creek, Tommy stopped. He turned in a slow circle, like he was listening to something only he could hear. Then he pointed to what looked like an impenetrable wall of honeysuckle vines. "There," he said, his child's voice carrying impossibly over the storm. James pushed through the vines, and his hand hit something solid. Wood. A door. Blue paint flaking off under his fingers. "The cabin," he breathed. Tommy pushed past him, his small hands finding the doorknob. It was locked, but when he touched it, they all heard the click of tumblers falling into place. The door swung open. The smell hit them first. Mildew, decay, and something else. Blood. Fear. Death approaching. The cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms. The roof had partially collapsed, beams and shingles scattered across the floor. And there, in the far corner, partially buried under debris, was a man. Miguel Santos looked nothing like the hero from the newspaper stories. His face was gray, his lips blue, his left leg bent at an impossible angle. His chest barely moved with each breath. Tommy walked straight to him, no fear in his movements. He knelt beside Miguel's head, placing his small hands on the man's temples. "Miguel," he said softly, "it's time to come back." The man's eyes fluttered but didn't open. Atlas and Storm arranged themselves around Miguel's body, their warmth pressing against him. Atlas began to lick Miguel's face while Storm laid his head on Miguel's chest, whimpering softly. "He's barely alive," James said, already on his phone trying to get a signal. "We need medical help now." But Tommy wasn't listening. He had closed his eyes, his hands still on Miguel's head. And then he began to speak, but not in his own voice. It was deeper, older, tinged with a Spanish accent Tommy shouldn't have. "Emma, mi amor, Daddy's coming home. Lisa, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I got lost, but I'm finding my way back." Sarah gasped. "That's not Tommy. That's not my son's voice." "It's Miguel," James whispered. "Somehow, it's Miguel." Tommy's body began to shake, like he was having a seizure. Sarah started forward, but Frank caught her arm. "Wait. Look." Miguel's eyes had opened. They were unfocused, confused, but open. His hand, trembling with effort, reached up to touch Tommy's face. "You," Miguel whispered, his actual voice cracked and broken. "The boy from the river." Tommy opened his eyes, and they were glowing. Actually glowing with a soft golden light. "I kept it safe for you," he said in his own voice again. "The piece of you that you gave me, but you need it back now." "I don't understand," Miguel said, tears rolling down his cheeks. "When you saved me, when you breathed life back into me, you gave me more than air. You gave me a piece of your soul, your strength, your courage." Tommy smiled, that innocent smile of a 5-year-old. "That's why I could hear you calling. That's why your dogs found me." Tommy leaned down and did something none of them expected. He breathed out, long and slow, directly into Miguel's mouth. Not CPR, not rescue breathing, but something else. Something that made the air in the cabin shimmer like heat waves. Miguel's body convulsed, his back arched, and then he screamed, not in pain, but like someone waking from the worst nightmare of their life. The golden light that had been in Tommy's eyes passed between them, visible for just a moment like a thread of sunshine, before disappearing into Miguel's chest. Tommy fell backwards, caught at the last second by his mother. He was unconscious, but breathing steadily. Miguel sat up, which should have been impossible with his injuries. He looked at his hands like he'd never seen them before, then at the dogs who were now licking every inch of his face they could reach. "I was dying," he said, his voice stronger now. "I was already gone. I could see the other side. But then I heard..." He looked at Tommy, unconscious in Sarah's arms. "I heard him calling me. telling me Emma needed me, that Lisa was waiting, that I had more to do. James had managed to get a signal and was shouting coordinates into his phone. "Medical helicopter in 10 minutes, he said. "There's a clearing about 100 yards east." "I can walk," Miguel said, which was absurd. His leg was clearly broken, but when he stood, supported by James and Frank, he could indeed put weight on it. Not without pain, his face showed that clearly, but without the total collapse that should have occurred. "It's impossible," Maria said. "So is a 5-year-old boy finding a missing veteran through dreams and service dogs," Frank replied. "I'm done saying things are impossible." They made their way to the clearing, Miguel leaning heavily on the men, the dogs refusing to leave his side. Sarah carried Tommy, who was starting to stir but not yet fully conscious. The storm, as suddenly as it had arrived, began to dissipate. The rain slowed to a drizzle, then stopped entirely. The clouds parted, revealing a morning sun that shouldn't have been so high in the sky. "What time is it?" Maria asked, checking her phone. "That can't be right. It says 11 a.m. We went into the basement at 6:30. "Time moves differently in storms like that," Miguel said, his voice thoughtful. "In places between life and death." The helicopter appeared over the trees, its roar drowning out any response. As the paramedics loaded Miguel onto a stretcher, he grabbed Tommy's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for keeping it safe, for bringing me home." Tommy's eyes fluttered open. He smiled sleepily. "The dogs knew," he said. "They always knew. They just needed someone who could listen." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Miguel to safety, Atlas and Storm sat beside Tommy, their mission finally complete. They were no longer crying. Instead, they looked peaceful, content in a way that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. "We should get Tommy to a hospital too," James said, "just to be safe." But Tommy shook his head, suddenly more alert. "I'm okay. Just tired. I gave back what wasn't mine." He looked at the dogs. "But they're staying with me, right?" James smiled. "I think that can be arranged. Heroes need their guardians." As they walked back through the forest, the path somehow clearer now, easier to navigate, Sarah asked the question they were all thinking. "How did you really know, Tommy? How did any of this happen?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his hand buried in Atlas's fur. "Sometimes," he said finally, "love is stronger than rules, stronger than what's possible." Miguel loved his family so much that he stayed alive when he should have died. The dogs loved him so much, they found the one person who could help. And the piece of him inside me loved him so much, it called out until we found each other again. "That doesn't explain the storm," Maria said, "or the creek flowing backwards, or any of it." Tommy looked up at her with those wise, innocent eyes. "Doesn't it?" he asked. "When someone needs saving, really needs it, doesn't the whole world try to help?" They emerged from the forest to find the school parking lot full of emergency vehicles, news vans, and what looked like half the town. Someone had seen them leave, followed the trail, called everyone. "There they are!" someone shouted, and suddenly they were surrounded by people, cameras, questions. But Tommy wasn't paying attention to any of it. He was looking back at the forest, where the storm clouds were finally fully retreating, leaving behind a rainbow that stretched from the trees to the school. "Look," he said, pointing. "The bridge." And somehow, they all understood what he meant. The rainbow wasn't just refracted light. It was a connection, a path between what was and what could be, between the lost and the found, between death and life. It was the same bridge Tommy had been all along. The news vans descended like vultures, but Tommy didn't seem to notice. He sat on the school steps, Atlas on his left, Storm on his right, their bodies pressed against him like living shields. Sarah stood behind her son, her hand protective on his shoulder, watching the chaos unfold around them. "Is it true?" A reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. "Did this child really find Sergeant Santos?" James stepped between them and the cameras. "The family needs space. There will be an official statement later." But the questions kept coming, a barrage of voices that made Storm growl low in his throat. The dog's injured paw was seeping blood through the makeshift bandage Frank had wrapped around it, but he still positioned himself defensively. "We need to get Storm to a vet," Tommy said, looking up at his mother. "His paw is getting worse." Dr. Patricia Wells, the local veterinarian, had already arrived, having heard the commotion. She knelt beside Storm, her experienced hands gentle as she examined the wound. "This is infected. He needs antibiotics immediately." She looked at Tommy with curiosity. "You're the boy who found them?" Tommy nodded, his small hand never leaving Atlas's fur. "They found me first." As Dr. Wells cleaned Storm's wound right there on the school steps, refusing to wait until they could get to her clinic, Officer Daniel Park arrived. Not James from the VA, but the local police officer who'd been coordinating the search efforts. "I need to take statements," he said, though his eyes kept drifting to Tommy with something like awe. "The hospital just called. Sergeant Santos is stable. He's asking for—" He paused, checking his notebook. "He's asking for the boy who breathes light." Tommy stood up immediately. "We need to go see him." "Honey, you need to rest," Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she could see the determination in her son's eyes. It was the same look he'd had in the forest, ancient and unwavering. "No, Mama. There's more. Something else is coming." Tommy looked at the dogs. They know it too. Atlas had gone rigid, his nose pointed toward the parking lot where a black sedan had just pulled up. A man emerged, tall, thin, with cold eyes that scanned the crowd before landing on the dogs. "Who's that?" Maria asked James quietly. James's face darkened. "Victor Walker. Miguel's estranged brother. He's been fighting for custody of the dogs, claiming Miguel is unfit due to his PTSD. Victor strode through the crowd like he owned it, his expensive suit out of place among the teachers and first responders. He stopped directly in front of Tommy. "Those are my brother's dogs," he said, his voice sharp as winter ice. "They need to come with me." "No," Tommy said simply. Victor's eyes narrowed. "Listen, kid, you don't understand. These are valuable animals, military trained. They're not things," Tommy interrupted, his child's voice carrying surprising authority. "They're family. And you hurt them before." The crowd went silent. Victor's face flushed red. "That's slander." "I never—" Storm suddenly lunged forward, not to attack, but to position himself between Victor and Tommy. The dog's hackles were raised, a growl rumbling from deep in his chest. Atlas joined him, both dogs creating a wall of fur and loyalty. "They remember," Tommy said quietly. 3 weeks ago, you came to Miguel's house when he was at therapy. You tried to take them. Storm bit you, and you kicked him. That's how his ribs got bruised. You can't prove that," Victor snarled, but his hand moved unconsciously to his left forearm, where bite marks were still visible beneath his sleeve. Officer Park stepped forward. "Mr. Walker, I think you should leave. Not without my property. My brother is mentally incompetent. These dogs are legally—" "Your brother is a hero," Tommy said, and though his voice was small, it carried across the entire parking lot. "He saved 13 children from drowning. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He struggles with memories that would break most people, but he gets up every day and tries. That's not incompetence. That's courage." Victor took a step toward Tommy, his face twisted with rage, but the dogs moved as one, not aggressively, but with clear warning. Their message was unmistakable: touch the boy and face consequences. "Mr. Walker," Officer Park said, his hand moving to his radio. "You need to leave, now." Victor looked around at the crowd, seeing phones recording, cameras rolling. His public mask slipped back into place. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward his car. "I have lawyers." As his sedan pulled away, Tommy swayed on his feet. Sarah caught him before he could fall. "Hospital," she said firmly. "Now." The drive to Riverside General was quiet except for the soft whining of the dogs in the back of Sarah's car. Dr. Wells had insisted on following them, unwilling to let Storm's injury go untreated. The media tried to follow too, but Officer Park set up a roadblock, giving them space. At the hospital, they found controlled chaos. Miguel's rescue had triggered something. Other veterans were arriving, drawn by news reports, social media posts, whispers of something miraculous. The waiting room was full of men and women in various stages of healing and hurt, all wanting to see the man who'd survived the impossible. A nurse led them through back corridors to avoid the crowd. "Mr. Santos has been asking for you," she said to Tommy. "He won't let us give him pain medication until he sees you." They found Miguel in a private room, his leg in a cast, IV lines running into both arms. His wife Lisa sat beside him, her eyes red from crying. A girl about 7 years old, Emma, was curled up in the chair on his other side, holding her father's hand like she might never let go. When Miguel saw Tommy, his eyes filled with tears. "You came?" Tommy walked to the bedside, the dogs following. Despite hospital rules about animals, no one tried to stop them. There was something about the moment that made rules seem insignificant. "I had to," Tommy said. "You're not done yet." Miguel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Tommy climbed onto the bed, his small body careful not to jostle Miguel's injuries. He placed his hand over Miguel's heart. "The piece I gave back, it's growing, getting stronger. But there's something else, something dark that needs to come out." Lisa leaned forward. "The doctors said there's an infection they can't identify. It's not responding to antibiotics." Tommy nodded like this made perfect sense. "Not that kind of infection, the other kind, the kind that lives in memories." He looked at Atlas and Storm. The dogs moved closer, Atlas positioning himself by Miguel's head, Storm by his feet despite his injured paw. "Tell them about the village," Tommy said to Miguel. Miguel's face went white. "How do you—" "Tell them," Tommy insisted gently. "It's the only way to let it go." Miguel closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "There was a village in Afghanistan. Intelligence said it was harboring insurgents. We were ordered to search it." His hands clenched into fists. "But the intelligence was wrong. It was just families, children. When we realized the mistake, it was almost too late. We pulled out, but you stayed," Tommy said. Miguel nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I heard crying. A little boy, trapped under rubble from a collapsed wall. Everyone else was leaving. Orders were to evacuate immediately. But I couldn't leave him." "You saved him," Tommy said. "I tried. God, I tried. But sniper fire started. I had to choose, stay and probably die with him, or leave and live with it forever." Miguel's voice broke completely. "I left him. I left a child to die." The room was silent except for Miguel's sobs. Lisa held him. Emma climbed onto the bed to hug her father, but the pain in his eyes seemed bottomless. Then Tommy did something unexpected. He laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine joy. "He didn't die," Tommy said. Miguel's eyes snapped open. "What? The boy. He didn't die. His name is Amir. He's 16 now. He lives in Kabul with his grandmother. He wants to be a doctor." "That's impossible." The building collapsed. "No one could have—" Tommy pulled out something from his pocket. It was a photograph, wrinkled and worn. No one knew where he'd gotten it. The image showed a teenage boy with a bright smile, standing in front of a medical clinic. There was Pashto writing on the back. Miguel took the photo with shaking hands. Lisa translated. She'd learned some Pashto during Miguel's deployments. It says, "For the American soldier who tried to save me. From Amir, who lived because you showed me courage." "How?" Miguel whispered. Tommy smiled. "After you left, another unit came through. They heard him crying, same as you did. They saved him. He's been trying to find you for years, to thank you. The darkness you carry isn't from leaving him. It's from not knowing." As if Tommy's words were a key, something shifted in Miguel's face. The gray pallor that had clung to him, even after the rescue began to fade. The monitors showing his vitals steadied, strengthened. Dr. Harrison, Miguel's physician, entered the room just then. He looked at the latest test results on his tablet, confusion clear on his face. "This doesn't make sense. The infection markers are dropping rapidly, without any new treatment." "Some infections aren't in the body," Tommy said, looking up at the doctor with those knowing eyes. "Some are in the soul." Before anyone could respond, the hospital's intercom crackled to life. Code Silver, all units respond." Lisa's face went pale. "That's an active threat alert." Through the window, they could see security rushing toward the main entrance. Officer Park's voice came over his radio, which he'd left on. "Victor Walker is back. He has a court order and a sheriff's deputy. They're demanding the dogs." Atlas and Storm pressed closer to Miguel's bed, their bodies tense. Tommy stood up, his small face set with determination. "No," he said. "They don't understand. The dogs aren't done." "Done with what?" Sarah asked. Tommy looked at each person in the room, his gaze lingering on Miguel. Healing. They're not just service dogs, they're healing dogs, and there are more people here who need them. As if to prove his point, Atlas suddenly turned toward the door. His ears perked forward, and he whined softly. Without warning, he bolted from the room. "Atlas!" Miguel called, trying to sit up. But Tommy just smiled. "Follow him?" They hurried after Atlas, even Miguel insisting on being wheeled along despite medical protests. The dog led them down the corridor to another room where they could hear crying, deep broken sobs that spoke of unbearable loss. Atlas scratched at the door until a nurse opened it. Inside was a young veteran, maybe 25, curled in a ball on his bed. His chart, visible on the door, showed he'd attempted suicide the night before. Atlas jumped onto the bed without invitation, pressing his warm body against the young man's shaking form. The crying stopped, replaced by stunned silence, then a single word. "Captain?" Miguel wheeled himself forward. "Private Morrison." The young man looked up, his eyes widening. "Sergeant Santos? But you're dead. They told us you were MIA, presumed dead." "Morrison was in my unit," Miguel explained to the others. "In Afghanistan. He was there the day with the village." Morrison's voice was hollow. "I've been carrying it, Sarge. The weight of what we almost did. What I almost did. I can't." He broke down again. Tommy approached the bed from the other side. Without fear, without hesitation, he took Morrison's hand. "You didn't do it, though. You stopped. That's what matters." "I wanted to," Morrison whispered. "When I thought they were enemies, I wanted to hurt them. What kind of person does that make me?" "Human," Tommy said simply. "Humans have dark thoughts sometimes, but you chose light instead. That's why Atlas came to you. Dogs know the difference between who we are in our worst moments and who we choose to be." Atlas licked Morrison's face, his tail wagging for the first time since they had found him under the school desk. Something about this young soldier had called to him, just as Tommy had called to them all. Storm, meanwhile, had limped to the doorway and was looking down the hall, growling. Victor Walker was approaching with 2 sheriff's deputies and a man in an expensive suit, clearly his lawyer. "There they are," Victor said, pointing at the dogs. "I have a court order. Those animals are to be released to my custody immediately." The lawyer held up official-looking papers. "Mr. Santos has been declared temporarily incompetent due to his recent psychiatric episode. As his next of kin, Mr. Walker has been granted conservatorship over his assets, including the service animals." "That's ridiculous," Lisa protested. "I'm his wife. I'm his next of kin." "Estranged wife," Victor corrected with a cold smile. "You filed for separation 6 months ago?" Lisa's face crumpled. It was true. The strain of Miguel's PTSD had nearly broken their marriage, but she'd never followed through with divorce, never stopped loving him. "It doesn't matter," the lawyer said. "The court order is valid. The dogs come with us now." Tommy stepped forward, placing himself between Victor and the dogs. "You can't take them." Victor laughed, an ugly sound. "What are you gonna do, kid? Call another magical storm?" "I don't need to," Tommy said. He looked at the deputies. "Did you know that Victor Walker was dishonorably discharged from the army for stealing medical supplies meant for wounded soldiers?" Victor's face went purple. "That's classified information. How could you possibly—" "The dogs know," Tommy said simply. "Atlas was there. He was younger, in training, but he remembers the smell of the medicine you stole, the sound of soldiers crying in pain because there wasn't enough morphine. He remembers you." Atlas stepped forward, his lips pulled back in a silent snarl. Not aggressive, but revealing. Showing everyone that he recognized Victor as a threat, not a protector. "This is ridiculous," the lawyer started, but one of the deputies held up a hand. "Is that true, Mr. Walker, about the discharge? It's not relevant to—" "It's completely relevant," the deputy said. "If you've lied on the conservatorship application about your background, that's fraud." The second deputy was already on his radio, calling for verification. Within minutes, they had confirmation. Victor Walker had indeed been dishonorably discharged and had failed to disclose this on his court filing. "The order is void," the first deputy said, tearing up the papers. "Mr. Walker, you're under arrest for fraud and filing false legal documents." As Victor was led away in handcuffs, shouting threats and curses, Tommy swayed on his feet again. This time, It was Morrison who caught him, the young veteran moving with instinct despite his own weakness. "Easy there, little hero," Morrison said. Tommy looked up at him. "You're going to be okay now. Atlas will help you. That's what he does. He finds the broken soldiers and helps put them back together." Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "How do you know?" "Because that's what Miguel trained him to do. Even when Miguel was broken himself, he made sure Atlas knew how to heal others. It's their purpose." Dr. Harrison had been watching all of this with increasing amazement. "This is unprecedented. The therapeutic value of what I'm witnessing." He turned to Tommy. "Young man, would you and the dogs consider visiting other patients? We have a whole ward of veterans who might benefit." Tommy looked at his mother, then at Miguel, then at the dogs. "That's why we're here. That's why everything happened the way it did. The storm, the forest, the rescue. It was all to bring us here, to this moment." Sarah knelt beside her son. "Tommy, you're exhausted. You need to rest." "Not yet, Mama." "There's one more." Storm, despite his injured paw, was already moving. He limped down the corridor, leading them to the psychiatric ward. The security doors should have stopped them, but a nurse recognized Miguel and, seeing something in the strange procession, buzzed them through. Storm stopped at a door marked with warnings. "Suicide watch. No visitors without authorization. Violent episodes possible." Through the small window, they could see an older veteran, maybe 60, sitting in a corner. He was rocking back and forth, muttering to himself, his arms covered in restraint bruises. "That's Colonel Harrison," one of the nurses whispered. "He's been here for 3 months, won't speak to anyone, won't take medication. He just rocks and mutters about the children." Tommy pressed his small hand against the door. He was at a school, like Miguel, but he couldn't save them all. The nurse's face went white. "How did you know?" "There was a bombing at a school he was protecting in Iraq 15 years ago. He saved most of the children, but 3 died. He's never forgiven himself." "Open the door," Tommy said. "We can't." "He's dangerous to himself and others." Tommy looked at Storm. The injured dog sat down directly in front of the door and howled, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry all the grief in the world. From somewhere down the hall, Atlas answered, their voices creating a harmony that made everyone's eyes fill with tears. Inside the room, Colonel Harrison stopped rocking, his head turned toward the door, and for the first time in months, his eyes focused on something real. "Dogs?" he said, his voice cracked from disuse. Storm howled again, and this time, Colonel Harrison stood up. He walked to the door, pressed his hand against the glass where Tommy's small hand rested on the other side. "The children," Harrison said, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't save them all." "No one can save everyone," Tommy said, his voice carrying through the door. "But you saved 17 children who grew up, had families, became doctors and teachers and parents. One of them is named Hassan. He named his son after you." Harrison's legs gave out. He slid down the door, sobbing. "Hassan survived?" Tommy nodded, though how he knew these things, no one could explain. "He's been trying to find you, to thank you. He says you carried him out on your back while the bombs were still falling. He says you sang to him to keep him calm." The psychiatric ward supervisor had arrived, drawn by the commotion. She looked at the scene, the dogs, the child, the veterans, the crying colonel behind the door, and made a decision that would later cost her job but save her soul. She opened the door. Storm limped inside immediately, going straight to Harrison. The dog laid down beside him, placing his injured paw on the colonel's leg as if to say, "See, we're both wounded, but we're still here." Harrison wrapped his arms around Storm and cried like he hadn't cried in 15 years. Not the broken muttering of madness, but the clean grief of finally letting go. "The dogs are medicine," Tommy said, looking at all the adults watching. "Not the kind you swallow. The kind that knows exactly where you're broken and sits with you until you heal." Dr. Harrison, no relation to the colonel, was furiously taking notes. "This is revolutionary. The therapeutic applications, we need to document this, study it." "No," Tommy said firmly. "You need to feel it. That's the problem with grown-ups. You want to understand everything instead of just letting it be." As if to prove his point, more veterans began emerging from their rooms, drawn by the howling, by the commotion, by something indefinable in the air. They gathered in the common area, a dozen broken soldiers with hollow eyes and shaking hands. Atlas moved among them like a shepherd tending sheep, stopping at each one, offering a nose to a hand, a warm body to lean against. Storm, despite his injury, did the same, the two dogs working in perfect synchronization. One veteran, a woman who'd lost her arm to an IED, knelt down and buried her face in Atlas's fur. "I had a dog," she whispered, "in Iraq. She died saving me from a sniper." Atlas licked her tears, his tail wagging gently, and somehow everyone understood what he was saying. "I know. She sent me to find you." Tommy moved through the group too, his small hands touching arms, shoulders, hands. With each touch, something shifted. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but subtly. A loosening of tension, a softening of expression, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. "How is he doing this?" Sarah asked Dr. Harrison quietly. "I don't know," the doctor admitted. "But look at their vitals." He showed her his tablet, connected to the monitoring systems. Heart rates are dropping, cortisol levels decreasing, brain activity is shifting from the amygdala, the fear center, to the prefrontal cortex. It's like watching meditation, therapy, and medication all work at once, but faster. Miguel had wheeled himself into the center of the group. "I know you all," he said. "Not your names, maybe, but I know you. The weight you carry, the ghost that won't let you sleep, the guilt that eats you alive, murmurs of agreement, some tears, nods of recognition. This boy," Miguel continued, gesturing to Tommy, "he saved my life today. Not just by finding me, by showing me that the connections we make in our darkest moments, the bonds forged in trauma and terror, they're not chains, they're lifelines." Tommy climbed onto Miguel's lap, looking out at the assembled veterans. "You all have pieces of each other inside you. Every life you saved, every person you protected, every sacrifice you made. It created a connection. That's why you hurt so much. You're carrying everyone else's pain too." "So, what do we do?" asked the woman who'd lost her arm. Tommy smiled, that innocent, wise smile. "You share it. You let the dogs carry some. You let each other carry some. You stop trying to be strong alone." As if choreographed, Atlas and Storm moved to the center of the circle and lay down, pressing against each other despite Storm's injury. They looked at the veterans expectantly. One by one, the veterans moved closer, forming a circle around the dogs. Some sat, some knelt, some remained standing, but all reached out to touch the animals or each other. The circle of connection was visible, not literally, but emotionally, palpably present in the room. "This is what Henry knew," Miguel said suddenly, remembering something. "My old squad leader, Henry Morrison. He used to say that dogs were God's way of showing us how to love unconditionally, how to be loyal beyond reason, how to forgive without being asked." Henry Morrison? Colonel Harrison looked up. Tall guy, scar on his chin, ran a literacy program for at-risk kids. Miguel nodded. "You knew him?" "He taught me to read," Harrison said. "When I was 7, before I aged out of foster care and joined the Army." He looked at Tommy. "Is that the cabin?" "The one where you found Miguel?" Tommy nodded. "Henry's spirit is still there, watching over the broken soldiers. He sent the storm to make sure we'd find Miguel in time." "That's impossible," someone said, but without conviction. They'd all seen too much today to dismiss anything as impossible. The hospital administrator arrived then, followed by what looked like half the board of directors. "What is going on here? This is completely against protocol. These animals need to be removed immediately." But before anyone could respond, something extraordinary happened. Every veteran in the room stood up, those who could stand. They formed a protective circle around Tommy and the dogs, their faces set with determination. "No," Morrison said simply. "These dogs are therapy animals," the woman with one arm added. "They're treating us." "More effectively than anything else has," another veteran said. The administrator looked at Dr. Harrison for support, but the doctor shook his head. "I'm documenting unprecedented therapeutic breakthrough here. Removing the dogs now would be medical malpractice." "This is a hospital, not a zoo," the administrator protested. Tommy stood up, walking through the protective circle of veterans to face the administrator. "You're scared," he said simply. "Not of the dogs, of feeling, of seeing pain you can't fix with rules and paperwork." The administrator stepped back, flustered. "That's ridiculous." "Your brother was a soldier," Tommy continued, his voice gentle but certain. "He died in Vietnam. You were 6. You never got to say goodbye." The administrator's face went white. "How could you possibly know that?" Tommy pointed to a small pin on the man's lapel, a gold star barely visible. "That pin, but also, you have the same sadness in your eyes that they do." He gestured to the veterans. "The sadness of carrying someone who isn't here anymore." The room had gone completely silent, the administrator's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for 50 years. "His name was David," the administrator whispered. Storm limped over to him, pressing against his legs. The administrator looked down at the injured dog, saw the pain and determination in those brown eyes, and something inside him broke. He knelt down, buried his face in Storm's fur, and cried for the brother he'd lost, the grief he'd never processed, the walls he'd built to function in a world that seemed too painful to face directly. "We all need healing," Tommy said, addressing everyone in the room. "Not just soldiers, not just people with visible wounds. Everyone carries invisible scars." The board members were recording everything on their phones now, not for liability reasons, but because they recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "What do you need?" one board member asked Tommy directly. "To continue this, whatever this is?" Tommy looked at the dogs, then at Miguel, then at his mother. "A room where the dogs can stay and people can visit them, where soldiers can come and just be. No appointments, no paperwork, no requirements, just a place to heal." "That's not how hospitals work," another board member said, but she was already pulling out her phone, texting furiously. "But I know someone at the Veterans Foundation who might be interested in funding a pilot program." Within an hour, the news had spread through the hospital and beyond. Veterans from other floors were arriving, some in wheelchairs, some on crutches, all drawn by the promise of something they couldn't quite name but desperately needed. The dogs worked tirelessly, moving from person to person, somehow knowing exactly who needed them most. Storm's limp grew worse, but he refused to rest until Dr. Wells physically picked him up and began treating his paw right there in the common room. "This infection is severe," she said. "He needs surgery." "No," Tommy said, placing his hand on Storm's head. "Not surgery. He needs—" The boy closed his eyes, concentrating. Salt water, from the ocean, and honey, and time. Dr. Wells started to protest that veterinary medicine didn't work that way, but Miguel spoke up. "My grandmother used to treat wounds that way in Mexico. Traditional healing. It worked when nothing else would." "It's how Henry treated Atlas when he got cut by barbed wire," Colonel Harrison added, memory flooding back. "Henry knew things, old things, about healing." Dr. Wells looked skeptical, but agreed to try it, if only because Storm seemed to trust Tommy completely. She sent an orderly to get supplies, sea salt, medical-grade honey, clean bandages. As she worked, Tommy began to sing. It was a wordless melody, something between a lullaby and a hymn. One by one, the veterans began to hum along, though none of them knew the tune. The dogs settled, their breathing synchronized with the rhythm. "It's the song," Miguel said suddenly, "the one I heard when I was dying. It was you, Tommy. You were singing to me through the storm." Tommy nodded, never stopping his melody. "It's the song that connects us all. The one we hear before we're born and after we die. The one that reminds us we're never really alone." The room had filled with more people now. Nurses, doctors, family members who'd heard something was happening. No one spoke. They just listened to the child's song and watched as something shifted in the air, something that made the fluorescent lights seem softer, the hospital's smell less sharp, the weight of suffering a little lighter. Storm's breathing steadied as Dr. Wells applied the honey and salt mixture. The dog's eyes closed, not in pain, but in peace. Atlas moved to lie beside him, their bodies touching, sharing warmth and comfort. "They're healing each other," Tommy said. "That's what pack animals do. They don't let one suffer alone." A woman pushed through the crowd, Lisa, Miguel's wife, with Emma. They'd been in the cafeteria when they heard about what was happening. "Daddy," Emma said, seeing her father surrounded by other veterans, all touching, all connected. Miguel held out his arms, and Emma ran to him. "I'm here, baby. I'm really here now." "You were gone for so long," Emma said, not meaning the 2 weeks he'd been missing, but the months and years before that, when PTSD had stolen him away even when his body was present. "I know, but I'm back. Tommy brought me back." Emma looked at Tommy, with the direct gaze children reserve for each other. "Thank you for fixing my daddy." Tommy shook his head. "I didn't fix him. Nobody's broken. Sometimes we just forget how to find our way home." An elderly man in a wheelchair had been wheeled in by his grandson. He wore a Korea veteran cap, his hands shaking with Parkinson's. "I haven't been able to pet a dog in 5 years, he said, holding out his trembling hand to Atlas. The dog moved slowly, gently, placing his head under the man's palm. Miraculously, the shaking lessened. Not completely, but enough for the man to stroke Atlas's fur. "How?" his grandson asked, filming with his phone. "Dogs calm the nervous system," Dr. Harrison said, but even he knew it was more than that. Or maybe it's about trust, about remembering what it feels like to connect without fear. The afternoon wore on, but no one wanted to leave. The psychiatric ward common room had become something else, a healing space, a sanctuary, a place where the normal rules didn't quite apply. Tommy had curled up against Storm, the big dog's breathing steady now, the infection already looking less angry. Sarah sat beside them, her hand on her son's back, watching him sleep. "He's different," she said to Miguel. "Ever since the river, he's been different. But today he became who he was always meant to be," Miguel finished. "Some people are born to be bridges, to connect what's separated, to heal what's broken." "But he's just a little boy," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "This is too much responsibility." Lisa sat down beside her. "My grandmother used to say that children are closer to heaven than adults. They remember what we forget, that love is the only real medicine." As the sun began to set, painting the hospital windows gold, something shifted in the room. The veterans who'd been isolated in their individual pain were now talking to each other, sharing stories, phone numbers, promises to check in. Morrison was sitting with Colonel Harrison, both of them with their hands on Atlas, discussing starting a support group. The woman who'd lost her arm was showing Emma how she'd learned to paint with her remaining hand. Others were making plans to visit each other, to not face the darkness alone anymore. "This is what was missing," Miguel said. "Connection. We were all trying to heal in isolation, but trauma shared is trauma halved." Tommy stirred, opening his eyes. He looked around the room at all the connections being made, the healing happening, and smiled, but then his expression grew serious. "There's one more," he said. Everyone looked at him, waiting. "Henry. We need to honor Henry." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "The man who taught me to read, who saved my life before I even knew it needed saving. He saved all of us," Miguel said. "In different ways, at different times, but Henry Morrison touched all our lives." "Then we should do something," Morrison said. "Create something in his name." Tommy stood up, still wobbly from exhaustion, but determined. "The cabin. We should rebuild the cabin, make it a place where soldiers can go when the world is too loud, where dogs can help them remember how to be quiet inside." The administrator, who'd been silent since his breakdown, spoke up. "The hospital owns that land. Henry left it to us in his will, but we never knew what to do with it. Now you do," Tommy said simply. "It would take funding, permits, construction." The administrator started, then stopped. "But it could be done. A retreat center, a healing space." "The Morrison Center," Colonel Harrison said, "for warriors and their guardians." Everyone nodded. It felt right, like something clicking into place. As they discussed plans and possibilities, no one noticed the figure standing in the doorway until she spoke. "Excuse me?" The voice was soft, accented. "I am looking for Sergeant Miguel Santos." Everyone turned. A woman in traditional Afghan dress stood there, holding the hand of a teenage boy. Miguel's breath caught. "Amir?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. "You tried to save me." "In the village. My grandmother and we came to America last month. We saw the news about your rescue. We had to come." Miguel tried to stand, forgetting his broken leg, and would have fallen if Amir hadn't rushed forward to catch him. They embraced, two survivors of a moment that had haunted them both, finally able to close the circle of trauma. "You came back for me," Amir said. "Even though everyone was leaving, you came back." "I'm sorry I couldn't get you out," Miguel said, sobbing. "But you tried. And that trying gave me strength to survive until the others came. You saved my life by showing me that I was worth saving." Tommy watched this reunion with satisfaction, like a conductor watching his orchestra find perfect harmony. The dogs, too, seemed to understand the significance. Atlas walked over to Amir, sniffed him carefully, then licked his hand, a welcome to the pack. "How did you know?" Sarah asked her son quietly. "About Amir, about all of it?" Tommy leaned against her, suddenly looking like the exhausted 5-year-old he was. The dogs knew. They carry memories in their hearts, all the people their person loved, worried about, grieved for. When I touched them, I could see it all. "That's not possible, Doctor," Harrison said, but his scientific skepticism was weakening. "Yesterday, a storm appeared from nowhere. A creek flowed backwards and a 5-year-old boy found a dying veteran in a cabin that shouldn't exist," Frank said. He'd been quiet until now, but he'd seen everything from the beginning. "I think we need to expand our definition of possible." As visiting hours ended and the hospital began insisting people leave, something remarkable happened. The veterans who'd been in the psychiatric ward, many on suicide watch just hours before, began organizing. They would take shifts staying with the dogs. They would create a schedule so no one was ever alone. They would rebuild Henry's cabin together, each contributing what they could. "This is just the beginning," Tommy said as Sarah carried him toward the exit. He was too tired to walk, but not too tired to hope. The dogs will find others. Other bridges, other healers, the network will grow. "Network?" Maria asked. She'd stayed the whole time, documenting everything on her phone for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. "The invisible threads that connect all of us," Tommy explained, his eyes already closing. "The ones that light up when we remember we're not alone." As they reached the parking lot, the media was waiting again. But this time, the questions were different. Not sensational, but seeking. People wanted to understand what had happened, how a child and 2 dogs had created such transformation. "It's not complicated," Tommy said sleepily into a microphone someone held up to him. "Love finds a way. Always, even through storms and forests and broken places. Love finds a way." The reporter, a hardened journalist who'd covered wars and disasters, had tears in her eyes. "What would you tell people who are suffering, who feel alone?" Tommy's eyes opened one more time, clear and bright despite his exhaustion. "Look for the dogs. Not just real dogs, the things that love without conditions, the connections that don't make sense but feel true, the bridges between what hurts and what heals. They're everywhere, waiting for us to notice them." As Sarah buckled him into his car seat, Tommy was already asleep, but Atlas and Storm, who'd been given special permission to leave the hospital for the night, sat in the back with him, alert and protective. "We're taking 2 military dogs home?" Sarah asked, reality finally catching up with her. "3, Miguel said from his wheelchair, Lisa pushing him. "If you'll let us follow you." "I need to be near them tonight, near him." Sarah looked at this strange procession, her son, 2 injured but noble dogs, a veteran who'd nearly died, his family who'd nearly lost him, and all the invisible threads connecting them. "Our house is small," she said. "Perfect," Lisa replied. "We've been living in spaces too big for our hearts to fill. Maybe small is what we need." As they drove home, the last light of day fading, Tommy stirred once in his sleep. "The sad man isn't sad anymore," he murmured. Sarah looked in the rearview mirror at Miguel's car following them. Through the windshield, she could see him holding his daughter's hand, his wife's hand on his shoulder, and something that looked like peace on his face. "No," she agreed. "He's not." Storm whined softly and Atlas licked his injured paw, taking care of each other, like Tommy had said. Like they all needed to learn to do. The next morning brought unexpected challenges. Sarah woke to find her small living room transformed into something resembling a military camp. Miguel had slept on the couch, his broken leg elevated, with Atlas on the floor beside him. Lisa and Emma had taken Tommy's bed, while Tommy himself had created a nest of blankets on the floor with Storm, whose paw was already looking better after Dr. Wells' treatment. But it wasn't just them. Somehow word had spread through some invisible veteran network. Morrison stood on the front porch with coffee and donuts. Colonel Harrison sat in his car outside, afraid to intrude, but unable to stay away. 3 other veterans from the hospital were parked along the street. "I'm sorry," Miguel said when Sarah came downstairs. "I didn't invite them. They just followed the pull," Tommy finished, appearing at the top of the stairs. Despite having slept on the floor, he looked refreshed, his eyes bright. "The threads are getting stronger." Sarah looked out at the gathering crowd and made a decision that would change her life forever. "Then, we'd better make more. Coffee." What followed was perhaps the strangest and most beautiful breakfast party the neighborhood had ever seen. Veterans with visible and invisible wounds crowded into Sarah's tiny kitchen, sharing stories and silence in equal measure. The dogs moved among them like healers, offering a nose here, a paw there, somehow knowing exactly who needed them most. Mrs. Chen from next door, an elderly Chinese woman who rarely spoke to anyone, appeared at the door with a huge pot of congee. "For the soldiers," she said simply. When Colonel Harrison helped her carry it in, she grabbed his hand. "My husband was soldier too. Korea. Never came home." They stood there for a moment, 2 people connected by a war fought before Tommy was even born. The mailman delivering packages stopped and stared. Then he rolled up his sleeve, showing an old Marine tattoo. "Iraq, 2003, he said. Without being asked, he sat down on the porch steps, and Storm limped over to rest his head on the man's knee. "What's happening?" Sarah asked Tommy, as more and more people seemed drawn to their house. "The healing is spreading," Tommy said, "like ripples in water. Each person who gets touched touches others." By noon, the local news had arrived, but instead of the circus from the day before, there was something respectful in their approach. The reporter who had interviewed Tommy at the hospital had come herself, not with a camera crew, but with her father, a Vietnam veteran who hadn't left his house in 2 years. "He saw the broadcast," she explained. "He said he needed to meet the boy who understands." Tommy walked straight to the old man, took his weathered hand, and said, "The friends you lost aren't gone. They're just waiting on the other side of the bridge." The man broke down crying, but it was the clean grief of release, not the poison grief of guilt. Principal Rivera arrived with a proposal. The school board had an emergency meeting. They want to create a program, therapy dogs in schools, starting with Atlas and Storm. But more than that, they want to create a space for veterans to volunteer, to share their stories with kids who need to hear them. "The bridge goes both ways," Tommy said, nodding. "Kids need heroes, and heroes need to be needed." As the afternoon wore on, something organized began to emerge from the chaos. Morrison had started a list: veterans who needed help, resources available, skills within the group. Colonel Harrison was on the phone with construction companies, getting estimates for rebuilding Henry's cabin. The woman with one arm was designing a website on her phone. "We should call it the Bridge Project," she suggested. Everyone looked at Tommy, who smiled. Perfect. But not everything was smooth. Around 3 o'clock, a official-looking car pulled up. A woman in a suit emerged carrying a briefcase. Child Protective Services. "Mrs. Chen," she said, finding Sarah in the crowd. "I'm Janet Williams from CPS. We've received concerns about your son being exposed to potentially dangerous situations." Sarah's blood ran cold. What concerns? Taking a minor into a storm to search for a missing person. Exposing him to individuals with documented mental health issues. Allowing him to interact with potentially dangerous animals. "Those animals saved lives," Sarah protested. "Nevertheless, we need to conduct an evaluation." Tommy appeared at his mother's side. "It's okay, Mama." He looked at Miss Williams with those unsettling, knowing eyes. "Your son has autism. You're scared all the time that you're not doing enough for him." Miss Williams stepped back, shocked. "How did you—" "Because you have the same look my mama has when she's worried about me. But your son, David, he's not broken. He just sees the world differently, like I do." Miss Williams' professional composure cracked. "The doctors say he'll never connect with people normally." "Normal is overrated," Tommy said. "Bring him here." "I can't do that. This is an official investigation." No, Tommy said gently. This is you being scared and trying to control things because you don't understand them. Bring David. Let him meet the dogs. An hour later, Miss Williams returned with a boy about 7 years old. David didn't make eye contact, didn't speak, rocked slightly as he walked, classic autism markers that everyone recognized. But the dogs recognized something else. Storm, despite his injury, walked straight to David and lay down at his feet. Not touching, not invading his space, just present. David stopped rocking. He looked down at Storm, and for the first time his mother had seen in 2 years, he smiled. Then he sat down and began to pet the dog with gentle, repetitive strokes. Soft, David said, the first word he'd spoken in 6 months. Miss Williams began to cry. Tommy walked over and sat beside David, not speaking, just being present. After a few minutes, David looked at him, direct eye contact that his therapist said he couldn't make. You see the colors too, David said. Tommy nodded. The ones around people? Yeah. Yours are blue and silver, like moonlight on water. Tommy's are gold and green, David told his mother. Like summer. Miss Williams looked at Sarah. I don't understand what's happening here. Neither do I, Sarah admitted, but I've stopped needing to understand. Some things just are. The CPS investigation was closed that afternoon. Miss Williams would return, but as a participant, not an investigator. David would become a regular visitor, one of many children who found their way to what was becoming known as the healing house. As the sun began to set on this second day of miracles, Tommy stood in the backyard with the dogs. The crowd had thinned, but the core group remained. Miguel and his family, Morrison, Colonel Harrison, and others who'd found something here they couldn't leave. There's more coming, Tommy said to no one in particular. More what? Miguel asked. More storms. More lost. Soldiers, more bridges to build. Tommy looked up at the sky where the first stars were appearing. Henry Morrison started something. We're just continuing it. How do you know about Henry? Colonel Harrison asked. You never met him? Tommy smiled. I met him in the space between sleeping and waking. He said to tell you all that the mission isn't over, that saving bodies was just the first part. Now we save souls. That's a big job for a 5-year-old, Sarah said, worry creeping into her voice. I'm not doing it alone, Tommy said, gesturing to everyone gathered. None of us are alone anymore. That's the whole point. A phone rang. Morrison answered, his face growing serious. There's been an incident. A veteran in Portland barricaded himself in his apartment. SWAT is on scene, but his therapy dog won't let anyone near him. Everyone looked at Tommy, who was already walking toward the house. We need to go. Portland is 3 hours away, Miguel said. Then we better leave now, Tommy replied. What followed was a convoy unlike any other. 3 cars full of veterans, a child, and 2 injured but determined German shepherds racing through the night toward another crisis, another bridge to build. They arrived to find a tense standoff. Police cars surrounded an apartment building. Residents had been evacuated. On the 3rd floor, visible through a window, was a man with a gun, his golden retriever standing between him and the door. The SWAT commander was skeptical when this strange group approached. This is a police matter. No, Tommy said, stepping forward. This is a soul matter. Before anyone could stop him, Tommy walked toward the building. Atlas and Storm flanked him, and the police, perhaps recognizing something beyond their training, let them pass. Inside the building, Tommy climbed the stairs slowly. He could hear the man talking to his dog, words slurred with alcohol and pain. I'm sorry, buddy. I'm so sorry, but I can't do it anymore. Tommy knocked on the door. Mr. Johnson? My name is Tommy. I brought some friends to meet Buddy. Go away, the man shouted. Buddy's lonely, Tommy continued. He told my dogs. They speak the same language. There was silence, then the sound of movement. The door opened a crack, held by a chain. A golden retriever's nose poked through, sniffing at Atlas and Storm. See, Tommy said to the dogs. I told you he'd be beautiful. The door opened wider. The man, Mr. Johnson, stood there with red eyes and shaking hands. The gun was on a table behind him, forgotten for the moment. You're just a kid, he said. Kids know important things, Tommy replied, like how dogs never judge us for our worst moments. He sat down right there in the hallway. Atlas and Storm lay down too, and after a moment, Buddy came out to join them. The three dogs created a circle, and Tommy patted the spot next to him. "Want to sit?" he asked Mr. Johnson. Maybe it was the absurdity of it, or the innocence, or the way the dogs seemed so peaceful, but Mr. Johnson sat. He began to talk about Afghanistan, about the friends he'd lost, about the nightmares that wouldn't stop. "Buddy's the only reason I lasted this long," he said. "Then Buddy's a hero," Tommy said simply. "Just like you. I'm not a hero. Heroes don't give up." "Heroes get tired," Tommy corrected. "But real heroes let others help carry the weight when they can't carry it anymore." One by one, the other veterans came up the stairs. Morrison, Colonel Harrison, Miguel on crutches. They sat in the hallway, creating a larger circle. Each shared a moment when they'd wanted to give up, how they'd found a reason to continue. "We're starting something," Morrison told Johnson. "A place where people like us can heal. We need every voice, every story, every survivor. By dawn, mister." Johnson had surrendered his weapon and agreed to hospitalization. But more importantly, he'd exchanged numbers with the group, made plans to visit when he was released, to bring Buddy to meet other dogs who understood. The police commander, watching all of this, pulled Miguel aside. "How did you know what to do?" Miguel looked at Tommy, who was now asleep on Storm's back, Atlas keeping watch. "We didn't. The boy did. He sees connections the rest of us miss." "That's quite a gift," the commander said. "And quite a burden," Sarah added, having arrived with Lisa and Emma. She stroked her sleeping son's hair. "He takes on everyone's pain. But he transforms it," Lisa observed. "He doesn't just carry it. He turns it into something else. Connection, hope, purpose." The drive home was quiet, everyone exhausted but somehow lighter. Tommy slept the whole way, but his dreams were active. Sarah could see his eyes moving behind closed lids, his hands twitching like he was reaching for something. When they arrived home, they found their yard full of people again. But this time, it was organized. Someone had set up tables, chairs, a coffee station. A banner hung across the porch. The Bridge Project headquarters. "Who did this?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Chen appeared with a clipboard. "The neighborhood. We decided if you're going to save everyone, you need help." And so it grew. What had started with a boy and two dogs in a storm became something larger. The Bridge Project. A network of veterans, families, dogs, and civilians working together to build connections where isolation had been. Within a month, construction had begun on Henry's cabin. Veterans who could work did, while others supervised, designed, or simply provided company. The work itself became therapy, building something positive from the wreckage of trauma. Tommy was there every day after school, the dogs always with him. He had a gift for knowing exactly who needed to hammer nails that day to work out anger, who needed to paint to find peace, who needed to sit and tell stories to process pain. "You're different from other kids," Emma told him one day as they watched their fathers work on the cabin's frame. "Everyone's different," Tommy replied. "Most people just hide it better." "Do you ever wish you were normal?" Tommy considered this. "Do you ever wish your dad hadn't gone to war?" Emma nodded. "But then, he wouldn't be who he is. And you wouldn't be who you are. And none of this," he gestured to the construction site full of healing veterans, "would exist." "So, bad things happen to create good things?" "No," Tommy said. "Bad things happen, but we get to choose what grows from them." 3 months after the storm, the cabin was complete. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds, veterans, families, media, politicians. But at its heart were still the same elements: a boy, 2 dogs, and the understanding that healing happens in connection. Tommy stood at the podium, which had been lowered for his height. The crowd fell silent. "Henry Morrison saved lives before I was born," he said. "He taught people to read, but more than that, he taught them they were worth teaching. He's still teaching us." He paused, looking at Atlas and Storm, who sat beside him. "These dogs came to my school crying because they'd lost their person. But they weren't just crying for Miguel. They were crying for all the lost soldiers, the ones still breathing but not really alive. They knew something we forgot, that nobody heals alone." The crowd was silent, many wiping tears. "This cabin isn't just a building. It's a promise that no veteran will face the darkness alone, that every storm will be followed by hands reaching out to help, that the bridges between us are stronger than the spaces that separate us. He looked directly at the camera broadcasting the ceremony live. If you're watching this and you're hurting, know this. You're not alone. Even if you can't see them, the threads connect you to others who understand. Follow the threads. Find your pack. Let yourself be found. As Tommy stepped down, the crowd erupted in applause, but he wasn't done. He walked to a corner of the cabin where a small plaque had been installed. On it were words he'd written himself. For Henry Morrison, who built the first bridge, for all the dogs who guard our hearts, for every soldier still finding their way home, the door is always open, the light is always on. You are never alone. As the ceremony ended and people began to tour the cabin, which had been equipped as a retreat center with spaces for therapy, meditation, and simply being, Tommy found himself alone with the dogs for a moment. "We did it," he told them. "We built the bridge." Atlas licked his face while Storm, his paw fully healed now, leaned against him. But even as they celebrated, Tommy sensed something more coming. The network they had created was spreading beyond their small town. Calls were coming in from other cities, other states. Veterans everywhere were hearing about the bridge project and wanting to create their own chapters. "It's going to get bigger, isn't it?" Sarah asked, finding her son in quiet contemplation. Tommy nodded. "The whole country is hurt, Mama. Not just soldiers. Everyone's carrying wounds they can't see. That's too much for one little boy to heal." "I'm not healing them," Tommy said. "I'm just showing them they can heal each other. That's what the dogs taught me. Pack animals don't leave wounded members behind." A year passed. The bridge project had chapters in 12 states. Tommy traveled when he could, always with Atlas and Storm, opening new centers, training other children who seemed to have the same gift for seeing invisible wounds. He was 6 now, in 1st grade, trying to balance being a normal kid with his unusual calling. Some days were harder than others. "The kids at school think I'm weird," he told Miguel one afternoon. They were at the cabin, which had become a daily gathering place for veterans. "You are weird," Miguel said with a smile. "Wonderfully, beautifully weird. You saved my life by being weird. But I just want to play sometimes, without feeling everyone's sadness." Miguel understood. The gift that let Tommy see pain also meant he could never not see it. Every person carried their wounds visibly to his eyes. "You know what I do when it's too much?" Miguel asked. "What? I remember that feeling everything is better than feeling nothing. For years after Afghanistan, I felt nothing. It was like being dead while still breathing. You brought me back to feeling. Even when it hurts, it means I'm alive." Tommy considered this. "So, feeling too much is better than not feeling? For people like us?" Yes. That night, Tommy had a dream. Henry Morrison was there, younger, standing in the original cabin before it had fallen into disrepair. "You've done well, young bridge builder," Henry said. "I'm tired," Tommy admitted in the dream. "Rest is part of the journey. Even bridges need maintenance. There's so much pain in the world." "Yes," Henry agreed. "But look what grows from it when it's tended properly. Connection, purpose, love. You've planted seeds that will bloom for generations. Will it ever get easier?" Henry smiled. "No, but you'll get stronger. And you'll never be alone." When Tommy woke, he found Atlas and Storm watching him, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. He knew they'd shared the dream somehow, these remarkable dogs who'd started everything with their tears under a school desk. "We're not done, are we?" he asked them. Storm's tail thumped once against the floor. No, they weren't done. There were more storms coming, more lost soldiers to find, more bridges to build. But for tonight, in this moment, a 6-year-old boy and 2 German shepherds rested in the quiet certainty that they had already changed the world. One connection at a time, one healing at a time, one impossible miraculous moment at a time. The next morning brought news that would test everything they'd built. A mass shooting at a veterans hospital in Texas. 7 dead, 12 wounded. The shooter was a veteran who'd been denied mental health services repeatedly. The media was calling it a tragedy. Politicians were arguing about gun control and mental health funding. But Tommy saw something else in the footage. The survivors huddled together. The therapy dogs who'd been in the building cowering in corners. The broken trust between those who needed help and those supposed to provide it. "We have to go," he told his mother. "Tommy, no, it's too dangerous. The situation is too volatile." But the calls had already started coming. Veterans from their network who knew people there. Families desperate for the kind of healing the Bridge Project provided. "If we don't go when it's hardest," Tommy said, "then what's the point of any of this?" Sarah looked at her son, still so small, still needing help tying his shoes sometimes, but carrying wisdom that seemed ancient. "I'll book the flights," she said. They arrived in Texas to find chaos, media everywhere, police, protesters on both sides of every issue, and in the middle of it all, broken people trying to make sense of senseless loss. Tommy walked through it all with Atlas and Storm, who'd been certified as official therapy dogs and given special permission to enter the hospital. What he found there broke his heart in new ways. The survivors weren't just dealing with trauma from the shooting, they were dealing with the betrayal of one of their own turning violent, the failure of systems meant to protect them, the fear that any of them could break that badly. "I knew him," one survivor said, a woman who'd lost her leg in Iraq. "He sat next to me in group therapy. How did I not see it coming?" "Pain hides," Tommy said simply, "sometimes even from itself." He spent 3 days in that hospital, not performing miracles, but something harder, sitting with unsolvable grief. The dogs worked tirelessly, absorbing tears and terror, offering their steady presence to people who had lost faith and stability. On the third night, Tommy found himself with the shooter's mother. She'd been hiding in a hotel, unable to face anyone, but somehow word had reached her about the boy who understood impossible things. "Everyone hates me," she said. "They hate my son, and I hate him too for what he did. But I also love him. How can both be true?" Tommy didn't have easy answers. Love doesn't stop when someone does terrible things. It just gets more complicated. "Can you see him?" she asked. "In whatever way you see things? Is he suffering?" Tommy closed his eyes, his hand on Storm's head. He was suffering before. Now he's trying to understand what he became, the pain that made him cruel. He wants you to know he's sorry, but knows sorry isn't enough. The woman broke down completely. Storm moved to her, this dog who'd been trained to comfort soldiers, now comforting a mother whose soldier son had become the enemy. "What do I do with this grief?" she asked. "You let it teach you," Tommy said, "about how pain can twist people, about how systems fail, about how we need to catch people before they fall this far." The Bridge Project's response to the shooting became a model for crisis intervention, not just treating the victims, but addressing the entire ecosystem of trauma. They worked with the shooter's family, the survivors, the first responders who'd had to stop one veteran to save others. "You're 6 years old," a reporter said to Tommy. "How do you understand these things?" "I don't understand them," Tommy admitted. "I just feel them. And I've learned that feeling them with others is better than feeling them alone." As they prepared to leave Texas, something unexpected happened. The hospital administrator approached them with a proposal. They wanted to create a Bridge Project chapter, not just near the hospital, but inside it, a permanent space where veterans could find the kind of connection that traditional therapy sometimes missed. "We failed them," the administrator admitted. "We treated symptoms but not souls. Your approach, it's different." And so another bridge was built, this one from the ashes of violence. It would become a model for integration of peer support into traditional mental health services. On the flight home, Tommy fell asleep against Atlas. Sarah watched her son, this child who'd become something she didn't fully understand but deeply admired. "He's changing the world," Miguel said. He'd come with them to Texas, walking on his healed leg, proof that miracles were possible. "The world is changing him too," Sarah replied, noting new lines of weariness on her son's young face. "That's how it works," Miguel said. "We save each other." Back home, they found the town had organized a welcome, not a celebration, that would have been inappropriate given where they'd been, but a gathering of support, people understanding that their bridge builders needed bridges too. Tommy stood in his backyard, surrounded by people who'd become family, dogs who'd become legends, and felt something shift. The work would continue, the pain would keep coming, but so would the healing. "What now?" Morrison asked. Tommy looked at the growing crowd, then at the dogs, then at the sky where storm clouds were gathering again. Not supernatural this time, just ordinary rain. "Now we keep building," he said, "one bridge at a time, until everyone has a way home." The rain began to fall, gentle this time. People didn't leave, They stood together, letting it wash over them, understanding that sometimes storms bring destruction, but sometimes they bring renewal. Atlas barked once, Storm joining him, their voices harmonizing in a song that wasn't sad anymore, but hopeful. Other dogs in the neighborhood joined in, creating a chorus that rose above the rain. Tommy smiled, his hand on both dogs' heads. They'd come so far from that morning under the school desk, but in another way, they were still doing the same thing, crying out for connection, for help, for hope. And people were still answering. As the months turned to years, Tommy grew, but his gift never faded. By the time he was 10, the Bridge Project had become a national movement. By 15, international. The boy who'd found a dying veteran in a storm had become a young man who helped the world understand that healing happened in connection. Atlas and Storm aged gracefully, their muzzles growing white, their steps slower but still purposeful. They trained younger dogs, passing on whatever mysterious gift allowed them to see pain and offer comfort. And in a cabin in the woods, rebuilt from ruins, a plaque reminded everyone who entered, "Love finds a way." Always, even through storms and forests and broken places, love finds a way. The bridge was built, and it would stand as long as people remembered that no one heals alone. Tommy, now 17, stood at the original cabin on the 5th anniversary of finding Miguel. Atlas and Storm, old now, but still proud, stood beside him. The cabin had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, a place where veterans and civilians alike came to remember that miracles were possible. "Did you know?" a young veteran asked him. "That first day when the dogs came to your school, did you know it would become all this?" Tommy smiled, the same innocent yet knowing smile he'd had at 5. "I knew something important was happening, that connections were being made that needed to be made. But this?" He gestured to the sprawling retreat center, the therapy programs, the thousands of lives changed. "No, this is what happens when enough people decide that healing matters more than hiding." As the sun set over the forest, Tommy thought about all the bridges built, all the storms weathered, all the souls pulled back from the edge. It had started with 2 German shepherds crying under a desk, but it had become something eternal, proof that love, connection, and courage could overcome the deepest darkness. The dogs leaned against him, their warmth familiar and comforting. Somewhere, Henry Morrison was smiling. The mission he'd started decades ago with a simple literacy program had evolved into something he could never have imagined, but would have deeply understood. We are never alone. We just sometimes forget how to find each other. But if we listen carefully, if we follow the crying dogs and trust the wisdom of children, if we're brave enough to build bridges across our broken places, we'll find our way home. Together. Always together. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and share your own stories of unexpected connections that changed your life. Remember, you're never alone. Somewhere, someone understands exactly what you're going through. Keep building bridges.